And here with me in studio to break this down further is international affairs analyst Dan Perry. Good afternoon to you, Dan. Thanks for joining me. There's reports in Israeli media that indicate that there's no progress on any kind of a deal, but then there's other reports coming out that saying Hamas is softening, hardening its demands. What is going on? Nothing is really clear here, but is this also just the art of the deal, so to speak?
I think so. During any negotiation, especially one that involves a terrorist group, I think we should be skeptical about anything being said in public, and a lot of it is posturing, and a lot of it may be an effort to influence public opinion by people involved in the negotiation who may not necessarily be the deciders. Israel would like to get the hostages back in exchange for something other than an end to the war. And Hamas is probably willing to give them back in exchange for an end to the war. That is, those two positions are in violent conflict. Can some elegant solution be found? I think it may lie, as I've said before in the studio, with amnesty for the leadership of Hamas and allowing them to exile, as the PLO was allowed to exile from Beirut in 1982. That has come up in a sideways manner via leaks from Qatar about a week ago. It hasn't been adopted, but I've always thought that would ultimately be an element of the solution. I think we have to wait and see. And the real problem is that for the families of the hostages, time is incredibly precious because they fear for their survival in captivity this long.
Absolutely. And of course, reports coming out just today that the hostage family members are pointing out that the mental health situation of many of them, apart from the physical, is also likely taking a major toll, being there 110 plus days. Now, intense mediation efforts have been led by Qatar, Egypt, as well as Washington, but they've also focused on what they've called a phased approach to the release of hostages. It won't just be the release of all 136 hostages that are being held captive in the Strip. And they claim that it would likely start with civilians and then soldiers, and starting with those that are alive rather than those that are bodies waiting to be returned to Israel. What is the logic in A, the phasing, and B, who gets to sort of go first?
Well, the logic is in a building of trust and enabling the public in Israel to accept, I think, what will be a very costly deal, basically. And just the fact that Hamas itself probably isn't willing to release everyone right now unless there is an end to the war. And I don't think Israel can give them that. There is no political will in Israel, I think, even though people will talk about prioritizing the hostages. In reality, those same people are not prepared, I don't think, to leave Hamas in power in Gaza. And we've been saying this for 110 days now. What happened on October 7th, more or less, from the Israeli, within Israeli public opinion, ended the discussion about the ability to tolerate Hamas in Gaza. There are narratives here that really don't align, and the government has sold the public this argument that the two goals are compatible. Many people in Israel suspect they're not, and I think there may be a time approaching when the public will have to accept the idea of a choice between one or the other. People in the government, and it's excruciating to understand this, but I think people in the government are willing to sacrifice some or all of the hostages in order to maintain Israel's campaign to get rid of Hamas, with the not implausible argument that that campaign is critical to saving many more lives, because if Hamas were to stay in power in Gaza, that would be interpreted, despite the ruination of the Strip, as a victory for jihad in a manner that will encourage more and more attacks. And even though I myself am a moderate who would love to see an end to the war, and is willing to accept a compromise, I tend to agree that this is a sine qua non. Hamas must not be left in power in Gaza. There's another question about whether there are ways to achieve that beyond nothing but blunt force. The government has refused to contemplate that as of yet, which I think is imprudent and extremely dangerous. The proposal being cooked up by the Americans, which would give peace with Saudi Arabia, which would end the disaster in the Red Sea and the bubbling war in the north, and would return the hostages and would remove Hamas from power in Gaza, certainly should be engaged with and explored.
Something else that's causing a major debate here in Israel is the idea of aid trucks passing through Israel as opposed to Egypt into the Gaza Strip. The argument being for many in Israel that are critical of this move that so many civilians took part in the rampage on October 7th. Why on earth should Israel then be allowing aid there? And also, when aid is not being given to the hostages that are in the Strip, but given to Palestinian citizens that have been displaced from their homes. But Egypt's President Fattah al-Sisi turned around today and said that this is a ploy by Israel to delay the aid going in order to put pressure on such a hostage deal, to which Israel responded, there's absolutely no limits on the aid, but of course Israel is going to be checking the aid, which is why it takes so long to go in. So we're really dealing with security concerns, diplomatic concerns. It's a very complex situation.
Yeah, and it also reflects Israel's no-win predicament, because if you don't let aid go in, A, that's inhumane, and B, that creates pressure to end the war, and Israel doesn't need that pressure. So on a moral and a practical level, Israel needs to let aid go in. But on the other hand, of course, if the aid goes in and is hijacked by Hamas, then that enables them to prolong their resistance to the idea that they should surrender. There's no easy answer here. I think Sisi's comments, and he's generally a friend of Israel, are disingenuous and maybe directed for domestic opinion. It's very, very clear that Israel has a legitimate need to check what goes in, for fear that what goes in will not be humanitarian aid, but something very different.
We are the problem. It's time to ask ourselves, how did we end up in a place where the citizens of Israel, the best people in the world, feel like they have lost control over their lives and no one is looking out for them? I've been living here for 60 years. This country has never been sadder.
Still with me here in studio, international affairs analyst Dan Perry. Dan, what really caught the attention of many, and it seems to have flown through very quickly Israeli newspapers, was Yair Lapid's comments that there's nothing to celebrate, also indicating that perhaps the people of Israel are incredibly united right now, but the political infighting continues.
I do think there are rays of light. After the incredible failure of October 7th, the people have shown great resilience and societal strength. But sure, the Knesset presents as a cacophony of mediocrities and mendacity and political quibbling and infighting, and it is basically a rather disgraceful thing to behold. So Lapid is right in that regard. It's interesting that amid this tremendous gap between the quality of this society and the level of its political representation, there's already talk of perhaps elections sometime this year, which would be an opportunity for the excellent people of Israel to fix the problem that, in fact, they themselves have created with their choices in past elections.
Well, that is, I suppose, the upside of being a democracy, but just in the past hour, the Knesset actually passed a preliminary bill that would allow soldiers to vote outside the territory of Israel, being in Gaza, which indicates one of two things. One, as you mentioned, elections could be on the cards in the midst of a war, and two, they may expect the soldiers to be in Gaza for some time. Yeah,
well, of course, those are two ways to read it. They could be complementary, they could be contradictory. In other words, it could mean they expect the soldiers to be there in a couple of years. But the fact that it passed so quickly does point to the other option. All this talk of elections in 2024 might, in fact, guarantee that there's no way the war can end before the election starts, and therefore this issue of the soldiers in what is essentially foreign territory being able to vote becomes extremely relevant. Those who find some comfort in the idea of an impending election should be pleased at the fact that this flew through the Knesset.
I want to get your weigh in here with regards to this possible report about the ruling on Friday. He made a very good point, saying that at the end of the day, this is still a UN organization. Is Israel, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, likely to get a fair shake?
The UN aspect helps Israel because they have to take into account the definition of genocide under the UN's own Genocide Convention. Under that definition of genocide, there clearly was no genocide here. That is clear. And therefore, even though the ICJ is quite political, they can't just ignore the facts. And therefore, the issue becomes something else. They could easily issue a temporary injunction based on the idea that something terrible is going on and that it's not been proven one way or the other. And this is a court that has no enforcement powers. It goes over to the UN Security Council, where the question is, will the U.S. veto whatever the Council wants to do as a result of that injunction? And that, therefore, gives the U.S. leverage to pressure Israel to take certain action. For example, as said before, to engage with its proposal for an end to the war, or to up its humanitarian aid that it allows into Gaza, and other things. And we should take into account something else on the political realm. Whereas there is no genocide by the legal definition as set out by the UN's own Genocide Convention. It's an entirely different matter when it comes to the popular understanding of the word in the street and in the world, which is the grisly killing of a whole bunch of people from one nation. And under that, not legal, but political definition of genocide, the picture looks quite different for Israel. And certainly the outcome, therefore, of whatever the court decides on Friday could create pressure.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned, obviously the distinction between those two definitions is obviously causing a major headache for Israel, given that many people around the world are watching very biased reports about purely the killing that is ongoing in the Gaza Strip, not
Absolutely.
The fact that it actually started from October 7th. So what can Israel do more from a PR perspective in terms of trying to counter that as of this moment?
Oh, that's a big question. But I would start with a beginning and ending every day with explaining Israel's conditions for an end to the war that is immediate. And the world would agree with those conditions. A demilitarization of Gaza, a restoration of the PA under rejuvenated and improved setup in Gaza, and a return of the hostages.
So do you believe that the Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, the IDF spokesperson, who does give daily briefings, is perhaps not matching up to that specific part of the briefing?
The army is subordinate to the government, and the government has refused to set out a day after that looks plausible to the world, and that could be sellable from a public relations point of view, for the simple reason that Netanyahu does not want to upset the far right in his government on which he depends. That is the reality, and I called it before reckless and dangerous. I stand by those definitions.